You'll have to forgive me, I had to clean off my glasses earlier. You ever cry? Anybody who wears glasses, you ever cry? And when you blink sometimes, you're trying to blink the tears out. Sometimes just tiny little droplets of them go splashing on the inside of your glasses, and it's just like, I just hate that. Let's start talking about the gameplay. Now, this game is basically the gameplay of Lufia 1, but better in every way. So the core combat hasn't really changed all that much. Hasn't really moved forward, except in, I'd say, 75 critical manners. Number one is the introduction and inclusion of the IP concept. Now, this is good for several reasons. So, first of all, what IP is, Itaki points or something like that? I forget what it is. It stands for something weird. But it's a pseudo-limit break system. As you take damage, you calculate something based on your guts stat. The higher your guts, the more you gain. So, you take damage, and then it checks your guts, and then you gain a degree of IP. You can then spend IP on special abilities. So that's cool. It's a nice little feature. It's a good little snowball prevention kind of mechanism, and it's a nice way to add other variants to what is otherwise fairly basic combat: attacks, items, spells. It also continues the good idea that Lufia 1 had. Spells are relatively cheap, and you have a nice big mana pool. So you have a lot of options for casting, and that's cool. In this game, you gain spells by money, but that's okay because gold is going to be tossed at you left and right. Really, the only thing that's really going to take up your money is either the casino or raising your capsule monsters. But here's what's really cool about the IP system. So, the way the IPs work, the actual IP abilities are on your gear that you currently have equipped. So if my coat is pretty high damage and defense, but, my other coat there in the closet, that one has worse stats, but allows me to cast an AoE heal with X amount of IP, well, then I might want to swap that one in periodically, or even just keep that as my main coat, because I lose a bit of stats, but I gain the ability to do an AoE heal on, Guy, for example. That's how that works. It's whatever you have currently equipped, and there's several different slots for that. And that's awesome in its own right, but what really makes that work is not just the dynamic itself, but the fact that they had to very carefully think about it. And this is where I give praise to the design especially. They had to think about what equipment dropped where and which abilities it had. And I point out all three of these things because these are three different aspects of design that all happen to dovetail into effectively one system, the IP system. If they didn't think about where items dropped or which items had which abilities, so any of those three steps, this system wouldn't work nearly as well as it did. So that's awesome. It adds a wonderful dynamic layer to combat. And as anybody watching the actual stream can attest to, I was using IPs in basically every boss encounter. That was my general approach. I would treat the IPs as the big cooldowns, spells from Suikoden kind of a thing. That's the big kind of a moment. So that worked out really well for me. And I was designing a lot of which gear I would keep on which characters and when around the idea of, well, this one gives it this stat, but this IP gives there. And I wanted certain, essentially, coverage. I wanted to make sure I had certain buffs, certain abilities, and certain attacks on different characters entirely based on their IP loadout. So that's awesome. It doesn't quite overcome a flaw this game does have. It's a flaw pretty much every old JRPG has. There are simply too many encounters. By a decent part of the game, I'd say about 2/3 of the way through the game, it got to the point where I started fast-forwarding every encounter fight because I was just kind of done with them. Now, I know what you're going to point out. You're going to say, Lore, hold on. You can dodge encounters, and I'll talk about that in a second. You're right, but if I want to ride, the yellow line properly, then I need to be Korean methoding, which means not skipping encounters. I never actually had to stop and grind, though. So even though it still has the encounter problem from most other JRPGs ever made, like Lufia 1, it does not have the grind problem. I never had to grind. And, more importantly, not only is the power progression curve pretty decent, but the difficulty curve is pretty decent too. There are a couple of individual moments which I think are kind of, but for the most part, everything was nice and smooth. So that's awesome, pretty much across the board. But you mentioned the encounters, so there's random encounters on the overworld, but the encounter rate on the overworld is actually really low, and that's good. Because that's kind of the filler stuff. That's the run in a circle stuff if you want to. The majority of the encounters you'll see is in the dungeons. So the way this works is every enemy has a different let's call it a pathing loop that it'll go through. Some will home in on you, some will go into random locations, some will actually try to run away from you. There's a couple specific patterns you'll see, like some will actually like run on the outline of a room, for example. But the enemies only move when you do. You ever play Super Hot? So if you just stand there and do nothing, all the enemies just stand there and do nothing. If you take an action, which is move, or use an item, or swing your sword, then the enemies move one thing. Now, some enemies move 1-to-1. They'll move 1 square when you move 1 square. Sometimes you have to move 2 squares for them to move. Sometimes you have to move like 4 squares for them to move. Sometimes they'll move 2 squares for your 1 square. So this is all kinds of awesome because it makes the encounters a lot more on you in how you want to deal with them. If you want to go through this like I used to as a kid, listen to me, a kid, I was already in high school at this point. If you want to go through this game like I did when I was younger than I currently am, there we go, nailed it. Then you can. You can just absolutely skip a majority of encounters, and you won't really be. You'll be having some trouble with some of the fights, but at the same time, careful tactics and planning, and that IP thing I talked about, plus the good itemization, means you can do that. This is a recurring trend. I've seen this in a lot of JRPGs specifically that I've covered. Just name 2 examples right off the head: Final Fantasy VI and Dragon Quest XI. Both of those games have systems in addition to just straight up vertical leveling. That is to say, just leveling, right? Just stats. And those systems, what they do is they unlock tactics and options for the player. Thus, not only can you play how you want to, but you can decide to just kind of nope out of combat if you want to, because you have other options other than running into a stat wall. If you remember, Lufia 1 had a lot of stat wall problems, so that's fixed too. So that's all awesome. There are a couple of other persnickety issues, which I can mention, but the real thing I want to talk about is the dungeons. Before I go any further, I've played all the way through this game 3 times now with this most recent playthrough, which isn't that many. I've played this game a lot, I'll talk about that in a minute, but all the way through, only the 3 times. The initial time, I didn't even know what capsule monsters were, because I never ran into any. And I had some bad memories of the middle part, but that's whatever. The second time, I picked up a specific capsule monster which was terrible that a friend of mine told me to get. It's the dark one, which has really low guts, which means it runs very easily. And that kind of sucked, but whatever. And I just kind of didn't want to replay the whole game at a certain point. But if you asked me why I said that 1 week ago, before we started the game, I wouldn't really have a satisfying answer for you. I do now. This game is pretty heavy on the Kingdom Hearts syndrome. The intro is quite strong, the outro is fantastic, the middle is a whole lot of filler. Now there's good stuff in there. Filler, remember, is neither good nor bad, it is simply filler. But there's also some padding, aka bad, filler in the middle, and while it doesn't get quite as bad as Lufia 1 did with its endless side quests, which are actually technically the main plot, it definitely does have few sections of, why are we doing this again? There's literally several sections where it's just, well, we've got nothing else going on. Let's go do that over there. We just kind of randomly adventure. It reminds me of Final Fantasy III in several ways. And again, some of that's good, some of it's bad. But that kind of forced me away from doing a full replay, which is a damn shame, because one of the biggest things I forgot about in this game are the dungeons. The dungeon design in this game is actually really good. This is probably one of the best dungeons I've seen in the game, in the era, and in JRPGs in general. I'm not sure I actually have a better JRPG off the top of my head in terms of dungeon design. Now, that may sound strange because they're all puzzle dungeons. This is a puzzle RPG in the vein of Crosscode or the Golden Sun duology. But, and I say duology because I haven't played the third one, so I don't know if that's true. But the puzzles aren't just puzzles. I mean, they are. Sometimes they're Zelda puzzles, and sometimes they're puzzles. I'm going to define that really quick because that came up during the stream. A Zelda puzzle is how the environment and the enemies and the tools you have all just kind of naturally inform, I need to get over there, so I want that lava flow to go this way, and then I want to freeze it here with this thing I have so I can cross the thing. It's just kind of a natural byproduct of the level design, right? A puzzle is when I need to get through that door, and so I go up to the door and it's got a Sudoku puzzle. That's a puzzle. And there's a distinction between the two, obviously, I suppose. I actually really love Zelda puzzles. I kind of suck at puzzles. I'm surprised I had as decent of a time in this one as I did. But that's just because they're really well designed. And varied. These are the two things that really impressed me, and I made that comparison to Golden Sun 1 very much on purpose. For those of you who haven't played Golden Sun, the first one, every dungeon in that game has a different gimmick to its puzzles, which is insane because there's quite a few of them, and they just kept coming up with new cool things you could do, and then they would have an entire dungeon themed around that new cool thing. And this game does the same thing. There are a couple of exceptions. I think we came up with like 4 exceptions throughout the course of the game, but I don't think I gave a single negative to a dungeon, and I gave many positives to the individual dungeons because they just kept being good. So, good dungeons, good variety, good kit, good tutorialization, good progression per curve. Like I said, the gameplay has just kind of improved across the board. Now, I will go ahead and admit that I think the gameplay in this game is merely below average. I know that you're praising the hell out of it, lore. I am. But I stand by that sentence when you look at all games ever, which is kind of how these reviews work. Now, where this game really shines is in the story side of things. Yeah. So, where do I even begin? I suppose we begin with spoilers. Spoilers in 3. It was his slate. I don't even know where to... I'm just going to jump into this. The first thing I want to talk about, I wanted to talk about this back in the Lufia 2 video, or excuse me, the Lufia 1 video, but I kind of didn't want to at the same time because spoilers, so let me just jump into this. I am very firmly of the opinion that the old man in Lufia 1 is Eric the Absolute. Now, let's talk this out a little bit. So, for those of you who don't remember, in Lufia 1, there's this old guy. You can meet him very early on. He's just there. He gives you a full heal anytime you talk to him, and he's part of this shrine network, and if you go there, you can teleport to a couple different spots. What that means is, as you're going throughout the game, you can reach back to him, thanks to those teleport spots, and end up getting hints. He'll always tell you what you need to do next. He is effectively your walkthrough. He's always guiding you and helping you. The game never explains who and what this guy is. Here's the caveat. When you get to the last dungeon, when you get to Doom Island and you start going through it, you walk through a shrine before you actually get to the last dungeon, and he's there in the shrine. And he tells you, all right, this is it, go do your thing. And it's like, huh. Then we have this game where we have Eric, who is so minor of a character as to literally only be mentioned, counting his one on-screen appearance, 3 times in the entire game. That's it. And I cannot tell you how much speculation and, theory crafting I've seen people do. In fact, I would love to hear your theories about Eric. So let me jump into mine. I think Eric is the AO of the Sinistrals, to use a Forgotten Realms term. He's the one who's not really part of the Sinistral thing. He's kind of in charge, but not directly, because he doesn't run things personally. It's more like he hands down a decree, and everyone just kind of goes along with it. The events of the plot are kicked off by him essentially saying, it's judgment time. The dual blade is resonating. Excuse me. Dual blade is resonating because it's a name, not the. Dual blade is resonating. So what's up? We need to determine if humans or Sinistrals should be the ones to run things. And if you pay attention, there's an undercurrent throughout the whole game, which is all about this central conflict. Should the Sinistrals be in charge, or should humans be allowed to guide their own fate? Eric is neutral in this matter. His only interest is their interest is to make things happen and see what the results are. So Eric just kind of stands back and lets things happen. But he pushes Arim into being involved in this, and she goes off and starts wandering around as Iris. And, well, this is where we get into some questions, because I do have my first question for you. Do you think Arim was helping us because she's Arim? Or do you think it was partially because of Eric's influence and Eric's direction to help us? She herself mentions that she was supposed to help us, but she went further than she should. So, debatable, obviously. And we're dealing with a localization that has some issues, as I demonstrated during the stream. So, this is all kind of a who knows on this one. I like to think that Arim is more inclined to help us than not. I also like to think that there's some backstory to Arim that we really need to dig into, because this is before she really interacts with any of the people in any substantial manner, the humans, and yet she's still already inclining towards being a relatively more positive force as opposed to being, well, evil, like the other 3 are, to put it into simple terms. But that brings me to my next theory. So we talk about the Sinistrals and we talk about them, and when we get to the final town in the game, we find out that there's a group of people there who have venerated and followed the Sinistrals, the gods, or super beings if you're playing the English version, for, however long. And they're weirded out by the fact that the three Sinistrals that have shown up are all evil. It is very strongly implied and stated partially outright that there are other Sinistrals which we never really see which are good. For the sake of clarity, I'm going to refer to these as Dextrals, for reasons that I hope I don't have to explain. So we've got Sinistrals, and we've got Dextrals. Now, one of the theories I had for a long time, and I actually have this theory even more now, is that Aram is actually a Dextral. That she is more neutral-leaning than she is evil, because she is, after all, the aspect of death. While she is certainly not a good person in several respects, one of the things that really stuck out at me is there's a section where we go to a town which has, supposedly, been wiped out by Amon. And Aram says we need to tend to the dead before we can do anything else. And we then do a fade cut, and she has given them all a proper burial and given them her rights, and they move on to the next life and whatever else they're actually doing in the setting, because we know there's some kind of an afterlife, or at least a moving on within the setting. And that just kind of strikes me as Aram's personality in one sentence right there. Caring for the dead, as opposed to being a force of death itself. That's my take on that. And again, I kind of feel like she leans more Dextral than not, which brings up the obvious question. Well, then what's going on with Deos, and why is she with the Sinistrals? So this game actually does a weirdly large amount of characterization for Deos in like 3 scenes. He has very little screen time. It doesn't show up until way into the game, in a shrine that is very buggy in its graphics, but whatever. This is a pretty buggy game, all things considered. In fact, it's amazing it's in as good a state as it is. It'd be nice to get a proper remake of this game. No, not the DS one, a real one. So, I haven't played the DS one, so I'm not sure how good or bad it is. I've heard nothing but bad things about it, though. I think, so the characterization we get for Deos is that he is a spoiled, petulant child who has a huge ego. He will do things pretty much entirely just to venerate himself and exalt himself over others. He is the strongest and the most powerful one, even though Amon's the one actually making the decisions, and Gades is the one actually enforcing them. He is Orcus on his throne, to put it simply. And then he's challenged, and he just kind of lets things happen because, oh, whatever. And then the dual blade chooses Maxim, and he loses his crap. Based on everything we've seen up to this point, what should happen at that moment is, well, the contest is over. Dual Blade, which is deciding who should rule their own fate, chooses the human, Maxim. Contest over. Judgment over. By all accounts, there should be no further conflict at this point onwards. And I'll bring that up in just a second, too. But instead, Deos is like, oh, well, just for that, I'm going to go be evil, and I'm going to hurt people and torture people and kill people, and I'm going to take my Doom Island, and I'm going to take my bow, and I'm going to go home. And I'm exaggerating slightly, but only slightly. He is extraordinarily petty. And this is true in every one of his interactions. He keeps insisting on, like, every time he loses and every time he's proven wrong, he keeps insisting, no, this isn't how it's going to go. I'm just gonna... And he keeps coming back and trying to be... Like, his grand designs go from ruling the entire world on high as Sultan to, well, I'm going to hurt you, and then to, I'm going to kill you, then to, I'm going to hurt you by trying to do whatever I can to damage those around you, and then I'm just going to, if I can't have the world, nobody can have it. Okay, well, I can't even do that, so I'm going to throw the Doom Island at your freaking kids, just to screw them over, just to do one last bit of pain before I go, because he is just that petty. Why is this relevant to Aram? I think Deos wanted to demonstrate that superiority that he's got by effectively lording it over other Sinistrals and other Dextrals. My thinking here is that Aram is the first, as in the first Dextral that he effectively pushed under his command and control and said, yeah, no, you're mine now. And then he was probably going to go for the other Dextrals over time. Again, my terminology, there's no term like Dextral in the game, but you get the idea, right? I want all the Sinistrals under my sovereignty. A very Olympian kind of a thing. But I mentioned a lot of things, actually, but I mentioned the fact that once the dual blade comes to you, the contest is over, right? Put the game in your mind for a second. What's the last dungeon in the game? Oh, it's Doom Island. No. What's the last actual dungeon in the game? Oh, it's the Three Towers. Still no. No, the last dungeon in the game is Graze, the big evil kingdom that's not fleshed out and is a negative to story because it's stupid. No, that's the actual last dungeon. And good lord, the last chunk of this game gets really rushed, but that's neither here nor there. After you do that, you go to the Three Towers, you get Dual Blade, and at that point you have won. The final bosses, of which there are 4, each of the 4 Sinistrals, and the final boss being Deos, who doesn't even have his own unique music, by the way. That's it. We have a term for this in game design. It's called Victory Lap. You have already beaten the final boss, and now you're just stomping them into the ground. Super Metroid does something like this. Tales of Arise, which we covered recently, did this. Several Sonic games do this. You get the idea. You've beaten the final boss, you've won, and now the game lets you just kind of play around with it for a bit because Victory Lap, right? At first, I kind of didn't like this, and I do think that the outro is fairly lacking on a gameplay aspect because it's really rushed, and the Three Towers are literally just corridors, functionally speaking, with a couple of enemies in the way. The last few bosses are boring bosses who literally just are a stack of HP who can barely do anything against you. But from a narrative perspective, I love it, because we are just running roughshod over the Sinistrals at this point. They are not a threat, because we already won. We already got Dual Blade. For those of you who don't know, you can use the Dual Blade. So every time you fight one of the Sinistrals, all of your IP gets filled to full, and you can use Maxim's IP with the Dual Blade. With Dual Blade. I hate that name so much. Which gives him this super mega death ability, which increases his stats by a ton, heals him up to completely full, and lets his regular non-empowered melee hits hit for quad damage regularly. So he just kind of starts stomping his way through the boss fights. There's not even any counters other than the boss fights through the last dungeon. So all of that lines up and makes sense in my head, but all of that is a little bit of patchworking on headcanon, and who knows, after all, we only really have 3 games to decide from, and all 3 of them decline to go into more detail on the Sinistrals, the Dextrals, or anything related there too. Eric is only in this game, really, so that sucks. But then we get to that outro. I gave 15 total positives to story for the outro, for each of the different moments and scenes and the way it did it. For those of you who don't know how the system works, an individual thing can only get up to 3 positives. That's the range. Good, best ever, in between. And same on the negative side. There's a wash, which is 0, and then we've got bad, worse, and then worst ever. So that's the range, those 7 points. But the thing is, if I was to give a positive to a dungeon, that positive is actually technically an aggregate of several other positives. Level design, or music, or boss design, or enemy encounter design, or itemization, or all the different things, because there's a lot of detail that goes into game design. And this is true on the narrative side as well. A scene might get a positive, but that scene is getting aggregate positives for cinematics and camera usage and lighting and voice acting and pacing and storyboarding and all the different things that make it up, right? That's why we can give more than 3 positives for the outro, because individual elements were getting their own positives, because it's just that good. I will freely admit I was actually worried walking into this, because I remember this outro very well. If you've been paying attention, back to the beginning of this video I mentioned that I played this game many times, but only played all the way through it twice, 3 times now. That's because I had a save right at the last save in the game after the end of the 3rd tower. And then I would just go and do the victory lap. I would go do the outro repeatedly because it was awesome and it was fun and I loved going through it. So I was really worried because memories are fickle things and the times can change your perspective, or your mood can change your perspective, or association can change your perspective. I've been victim of all 3 of these things within the course of, let me say this more correctly. I have corrected myself on all 3 of these things over the course of this review series we've been doing for several years now. But no, the outro really is that good. I could talk in detail about it, about how fantastic it is. In virtually every way, the fact that Salon dies so quickly. She dies in seconds. It's not drawn out. What happens is they're all pouring their life energy into this, their constitution, their soul, their will, whatever you want to call it, their flow. And that is actually cracked. Salon, having already burned all that health, all that life, then is injured by the explosion and is knocked down and dies in seconds in Maxim's arms. Then the other two flee, and they go forth, and they go into Lufia 1 to share the story and legend of the end of Lufia. But here's the really interesting part. What actually ends up happening is Deos shows up and is like, hey, I'm still a petty, pathetic asshole. I'm going to go ahead and smash this city into your home to kill your son. Bye. And so Maxim's like, crap, now what? That's when Aram shows up. And she decides to help us, and an amazing song starts playing. And the song is so beautiful. I wish, you know what? Listen to this song for a second. Just take it in. It's a tragic song. It's not quite full sorrow, but there's a definite air of death or finality to it. And yet the pace and the tempo is rapid as Maxim is rushing through this place. No encounters, no enemies. Just rushing through this place. And like so many other games before and after this, the game makes you do it. You have to hit the button. There's no other choice, there's no other options, but it's still on you, the player, to actually make the character go and kill themselves in order to do this, because he has to burn his life, like Salon was doing earlier, into these stones to knock out the control mechanism and prevent this disaster. He has to do that, so do you. And then, I'm not sure my timing, because obviously I can't hear anything, I don't have any headphones or anything, and I'm going to edit this in later, but when the music in the background, there's these strings accompaniment, and they are very heroic, and it's weird in this otherwise tragic and terrifying scene, this song, for that to be there, but then the strings rise up and have this heroic rejoinder of, all my terminology is wrong, but you know what I mean, the music pulls you into the moment of this sacrifice. And here's the thing that really works for me here. Several times in this game, we do things that end up being right, but not because we knew it at the time. There's something that goes on behind the scenes or behind the curtain that nobody else is aware of that fixes things or smooths things over or makes things work out. You haven't heard me talk about the theme of this game yet, and I thought very hard about this before I actually sat down to record this. Because I think the theme of this game is who you are when you're alone in the dark. A lot of characters show who they really are when no one else is there to see them, or when they think no one else is there to see them. When Maxim and Salon go to the mirror to prove that they truly love each other, they have no one to prove that to anyone but themselves, and they both decide equally, no, we're good. We love each other. We don't need the mirror to prove that. When Tia leaves the party, she does so quietly and in the background without making a big fuss, and if not for the fact that Decker was there, she would have simply left, and that would have been the end of it. When, just before that scene, there's this wonderful scene, and this is where we really get into this concept. There's this wonderful scene where Iris, that is to say, Aram, is... Maxim has just defeated Gades. Gades is like, I'm going to make the tower kill people. It's going to suck. So Maxim goes through and stops the tower and basically lays down to die. Aram shows up, grabs him, pulls him out. She didn't have to do that. In fact, she's arguably going against the flow. She's putting the finger on the scale is what she's doing. But she does that even though nobody really is going to know that she did that. And this also ties into another wonderful scene. But I don't want to get off. I don't want to get off on that just yet. I'm going to build up to this. So what happens at the end is Aram and Maxim, and arguably Dualblade, all sacrifice the last of themselves to stop this thing. No one will ever know. I mean, a couple of people will know, but essentially no one will ever know. No one will ever sing their tales. No one ever will champion this. There's no benefit. There's no reward. There's no parade. They do this because it's the right thing to do, regardless. And this is important to me, too. Sacrifice and tragedy can work for me, but only if there's a net benefit from it, is how I want to describe that. There's a lot of works of fiction that have done this, and I will not share any right now because it's super spoilers to talk about any of them. But in this case, the realm where spoilers are free for Lufia 2, I want to say that in this case, what he does works. This works. His sacrifice is not in vain. Aram's last-ditch effort is not in vain. This final thing costs them, but it works. And they save a whole lot of people, obviously their son. And it's very obvious that he is doing it for his son. But they do it. And you might think, well, that's selfish and awful and horrible, and you're debatable? I'm not going to say you're wrong or right on that one. But something that's stuck with me ever since a certain Solarian mentioned it is that, generally speaking, it's not great to keep in mind the big picture. You want to keep on focused on something grounded, a little sanity anchor, if you will, to use my own terminology. You want something that matters. You could save the galaxy, sure. What you really want to do is save your favorite nephew. And that's what Maxim's doing. He is saving his son. He obviously wants to save all those other people, but that is what drives him. That's what it is mind. That's what keeps him grounded. That's what gives him the strength he needs to do it. And speaking of sacrifice, there's one last sacrifice I want to talk about. So I'm getting dried up here talking about this. My goodness. Maxim is crazy. I actually think there's something literally wrong with him. Like, maybe wrong is the wrong word, but non-normal about him. I know what you're going to say. Well, yeah, he's the chosen one. No, I have this weird feeling that because of his flow and the force and the energy and the attunement and all the frequency thing they talk about, that he is so focused on being this ultimate warrior that he can't really be a normal person, that it's not really possible for him anymore. That so much of what a normal human being would have has effectively been burned away or deleted to make room for all of that extra knowledge and skill and fortitude and everything he needed to be the hero that he was. Now, this is headcanon in theory, but what is not is that he is crazy. This is a guy who starts an entire quest to go save the world because a woman in a cave told him to. There are other incidences and other examples of this. The idea that even becoming a shopkeep makes him laugh because it's so ludicrous to even consider such a thing. Or how about the fact that he has only ever known fighting his entire life. Ever since he was a child, he has been good with a sword. Stuff like that, right? That's where the headcanon sprouts from. Maxim's crazy. And Tia, who has been watching over him, taking care of him since forever, loves the hell out of him for it. And is very much interested in him and is quite overt about that. But Maxim never once shows any interest in return romantically. He obviously cares about her a great deal, but he never has eyes for her, so to speak. Then Salon shows up. Now this is interesting, because she's a badass who kicks ass and fights and is crazy. This is a woman who literally flails a sword around in the house when she's having an argument with her husband. Again, not headcanon, that's in the game. I think that at the beginning of their relationship, Salon and Maxim had very surface level puppy love at best, right? Just very basic elements of you're hot because she happened to be something that he was interested in. In short, if Tia was this badass, punch, kick, fight person, I have a feeling Maxim would have been romantically attracted to her. But she wasn't. She's smart. Actually, she's probably one of the smartest, if not the smartest characters in the game overall, if we balance out int and wisdom. The only one that can really challenge that is our good friend, Mr. Shia, or Dr. Shia, I suppose. But Lexus, that's his name. But this then leads to the big moment. There's one scene I have to point out. There's no real foreshadowing for Maxim and Salon really becoming romantically attached to each other. It just comes up in one scene. Maxim, Salon, and Tia are adventuring. Tia falls into a hole. Maxim's like, oh gosh. Salon jumps down after her. Maxim's like, what are you doing? You're stupid. Jumps down, fights the enemy, and then chastises Salon for being so stupid and jumping down. Then Salon falls down a hole. Maxim, without hesitation, leaps right after her. Ouch. That says so much about where his priorities are. I don't even think he realized it at the time. Tia, of course, picks up on this, because she's smart. And that's where we get into that final sacrifice. Tia sacrifices her future and her happiness for his. It could be argued that Tia walking away from the party is what really pushed most of the events of this game and the next one, Lufia 1, into motion. And it's a quiet sacrifice. She doesn't die. She just walks away from the life she wants and the love she wants and all that and just says, okay. And I think what I like best about that is twofold. First of all, it shows that she really loves him, that she has the emotional and intellectual depth and complexity necessary to understand what that word means, something Salon and Maxim, at the beginning, do not have. Now, Maxim and Salon do develop into this. After all, we do have at least a year of a time skip, and of course, I mentioned the mirror scene earlier. But then we cut to the end of the game. The first time I ever watched this game, played this game, watched this game, I'm pretty sure I have cried before I played this game in a video game. I'm pretty sure I have, but I have no distinct memories of that. What I remember instead is a specific day, and I can remember the day. I remember what was going on in the day. I remember where I was at and what I was doing, and the specific layout of the apartment at that point in my life. And I was playing Lufia 2, and you're probably thinking, oh, so the outro got to you. Today, when I played through it, the outro got to me 3 separate times. But when I played it the first time, it only got me once. And that's the exact moment that this song started playing. Tia, who it's mentioned earlier, doesn't really cry. She has a whole scene where she explains that she used to be teased for crying, so she trained herself to have the self-control to not. So she didn't cry, and hasn't cried for the entire time she's been in the game, and been on screen, excuse me. But as we get to the outro, and we get to the ending, then there's this moment where she just looks up, and she just starts bawling. She doesn't know why. She may never actually find out why. I imagine she found out at some point. Word is probably going to spread at some point. But she just starts crying. And that's the moment that broke me. Because her great sacrifice was not just, I'm saying this wrong. It's essentially the conclusion of her great sacrifice. That she walked away from that life, and that love, and that happiness, and now it is 100%, no really, concluded. Her friend, and the person she cared about, is now gone. And that's what she gave up for the greater good, or for the future of the people, or however you want to think of that. But she did it, and she did it willingly and knowingly. And that is in many ways the great power of the tragedy of this game. Now, I hate to do this here, but I'm not 100% sure how to do this properly. So I'd love to have some big animated graphic here, but I would need it in a manner I could template. And if I'm being honest, my specialty is graphics that don't move. So I could throw something together here, but I need something that can actually be animated. If anybody knows anything that could work for this, like the economic leaderboard that's done over on Economics Explained would be a good example of this. But if anybody knows, feel free to toss me a line. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of run through something here. So let's go ahead and kind of get rid of me here for a second. Because what I want to show you is how this game lines up with others of its ilk. I'm going to do these by genres, okay? So here we have the genre of RPGs, and we've covered a few of these. Now, we've already seen how... Now, I actually don't know the numbers right now because I literally haven't made the chart that you are seeing right now. But I just kind of wanted to show you this. This is where it lines up, okay? So here's our RPGs. Here's everything. And what I plan to do is I plan to kind of supersede this with where Lufia 2 sits. And you can kind of see how it lines up. So over here we have Lufia 2 in terms of where it's at in terms of just raw story. And over here we have it in terms of its story density. Now, I should explain this briefly for those of you who didn't catch this. Story density is exactly what it sounds like. It's how many story positives a game got per hour. It is how quality the game is relative to its length. Then we have the ratio. Again, anything above 50% is good, anything below 50% is bad. And the higher that number is, the better. This is the ratio of how many points the game got total are positive. And then, of course, we see the same thing on gameplay. This is where it sits on the overall gameplay score, the net score. And then we see how it sits on the ratio. And then we see how it sits on our density, because I should have said density first. Hey, future me, do density first. Okay. Now we can do the ratio, which we'll go ahead and show. And of course, at the end of the day, this is where it sits on the golden number, which takes everything into account, in addition to some factors I didn't show here. I'm taking feedback on how I'm doing this, so I'll, however much mud you want to sling here. And of course, I do look forward to your comments, as I always do. Hope you've enjoyed. I'll see you next time.